Let's look at how narcissism relates to various models of personality. Let's look first of all at how narcissism relates to the big five personality traits. Now, the big five personality traits are kind of the standard model that we use in research psychology. They're basically five categories or five factors that most individual characteristics fall into across virtually all cultures. Now, what do we mean by this? The way that researchers discovered the big five was they got these long lists of adjectives, all the adjectives that they could think of that would describe people, hundreds, sometimes thousands of adjectives, and they'd ask people to, how well does each adjective describe you? Or to think of some other person, how well does that adjective describe that person? And then they did what's known as a factor analysis to see which words went together with each other and across all the different cultures, or almost all the cultures that they tried doing this in, and all the different languages, the same five groupings came out. And so that's why this is called the Big Five model of personality traits, or the five factor model. And these five factors are extroversion. That's the personality trait that's easiest to see in somebody, how outgoing and social somebody is compared to introverted, less outgoing. There's openness to experience. How open are people to new ideas and doing new things versus being less open? There's neuroticism, which is kind of like how easily do people express negative emotions towards other, especially anger and worry. So at one end you've got neuroticism, at the other end you've got emotional stability with few negative emotions expressed. There's agreeableness. Basically, how much does somebody want to agree with others to get along versus being less relationship oriented and not necessarily trying to agree with somebody for the sake of a relationship. And then there's conscientiousness. How reliable and how much do people pay attention to getting tasks done versus people who are more spontaneous and impulsive, who are less conscientious. So those are the big five personality traits that almost all other personality traits are related to. But it turns out that narcissism does not fit into the big five. It's not well predicted by the big five. You can't look at somebody's big five uh, profile and say, oh, that person's probably narcissistic. But when we do look at people's personality files, or big five personality traits, we do see that there are a couple clusters that describe two types of narcissism. When people are narcissism, they generally fit into one of these two categories. When people are high in narcissism, there's grandiose, or sometimes it's called extroverted narcissism, and there's vulnerable, or sometimes called introverted or covert narcissism. So this grandiose narcissism are people that are high in narcissism, but they also are high in extroversion, they're low in neuroticism, and low in agreeableness. And this is the stereotype narcissist that's in love with themselves and is telling everybody about themselves. And this is what we generally think of when we think of a narcissistic leader, because extroversion is a real good predictor of leadership. But there's also a second grouping, and this is called vulnerable narcissism or introverted narcissism or covert narcissism, where the person has low extroversion. They tend to be introverted, but high neuroticism. So a lot of anxiety about what people think about them and if people will recognize them, but not necessarily going out and telling people how great they are. But they're also characterized by low agreeableness. Now, these two different narcissisms, once that now that they're better understood, it solves a lot of the problem that we saw in literature. A lot of times you'll hear that, oh, narcissists are really just insecure. But then you think about some of the narcissists and they are too secure. They don't have a low self-image. They've got too high of a self-image. Those are the grandiose or the extroverted narcissism. The narcissists that are insecure are the vulnerable narcissists. And that's why they're called vulnerable, because they are insecure. They're high in that neuroticism. And they're low in extroversion and low in agreeableness. So the big five do help us understand the different varieties of narcissism that exist out there. But if we move from the big five to what's beginning to be known as the big six, or sometimes it's called the hexaco model, we see that narcissism plays a big role in this. So what is the big six? Well, the big five was developed around the early 1990s when everybody had computers and they could do a factor analysis of 5 traits. Around the year 2000, they started saying, well, we've got enough computer power. Let's look for a 6th trait. See if we can get a model with 6 factors. If we divide all the personality traits up into 6 factors, let's see what we get and see if it's the same across all cultures. And sure enough, it was. And so we get basically the same 5 traits as in the big five, plus a 6th trait, which at one end has honesty and humility together, words that describe honest and humble people. And which is interesting because a lot of times you don't think that honesty and humility go together, but when we start looking at the traits, sure enough, humble people, people high in humility, tend to be honest, and honest people tend to be humble. So that's at one end, honesty and humility, and then at the other end, you guessed it, is dishonesty and narcissism. So this 6th trait, honesty and humility, is strongly negatively correlated with all measures of narcissism. If somebody's high in honesty and humility, that means they're low in narcissism. If they're low in honesty and humility, that means they are high in narcissism. There's another group of personality traits called the dark triad, and that includes psychopathy, this idea of not caring about other people and being willing to do things that hurt them without much remorse. Machiavellianism, the willingness to use people, to hurt people to achieve one's own goals. And then narcissism, which we've seen is where you have this sense of entitlement because you think you are so good. It turns out that if you take the common factor of how the dark triad is typically measured, the 3 versions of psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, this common factor is pretty much the same thing as the inverse of honesty, humility. So it seems to be a pretty basic trait. That's the 6th main personality trait that describes humans across all cultures. Now, something interesting is that this trait, honesty, humility, is an excellent measure of predicting immoral behavior, unethical behaviors in people, which you would kind of expect if they're not going to be honest. So it's strongly associated with all kinds of unethical behaviors associated with sex and money and power, typically the things that can really trip up leaders. So how do people measure honesty and humility? Well, there's lots of different honesty humility scales, and a lot of them measure slightly different versions of it. But a useful measure is called the mini IPIB-6. It's made out of just a few items that measure the big 6 personality traits. And so the items on the mini IPIB-6 that measure narcissism, or the opposite of honesty humility, are I feel entitled to more of everything, capturing that sense of entitlement. I deserve more things in life, again, this idea of entitlement. I would like to be seen driving around in a very expensive car, which captures the person's desire for status and to be seen as superior than others. And then I would get a lot of pleasure from owning expensive luxury goods. And again, that's measuring the desire for status. And these work better than asking people, are you a narcissist, or are you honest? Because when you're dishonest, you're not going to especially admit to these things. These items, the social desirable response is less obvious and depends on how you think about it. Depending on how you think about it, the socially desirable response from your perspective might actually be in the direction of narcissism. So here are a few questions that you can think of. Does your experience with people confirm that honesty and humility go together, just as narcissism and dishonesty go together? So do those traits group together, honesty and humility at one end going together, and narcissism and dishonesty going together at the other? And then a second question to think about: have you encountered both grandiose narcissists and vulnerable narcissists? Excuse the spelling error of narcissists there.